How many of you have seen the movie Dirty Dancing? I love that movie. But there's this scene in it, if you happen to remember, where a minor character recommends the book The Fountainhead to the main character played by Jennifer Grey. Her name's Baby. And he says, read this book, you'll learn from it some people count and some people don't. And it's always perplexed me why the writers of that movie took that message away from the book. I think it's mistaken for reasons that I'll soon talk about. And that's not the only popular misinterpretation of the message of the Fountainhead. There's all kinds of them, but another one that comes to mind of relevance to what we're going to discuss is there's a scene in the sitcom Frasier, another show I love. But Frasier is reminiscing about the day he first decided to become a psychiatrist. And he says, it was the day the older boys threw my copy of The Fountainhead under the bus. And he realizes upon the advice of a mentor that the reason he decided to become a psychiatrist was because he was afraid of other people and wanted to use that field to maintain psychological distance from him. But here, from them. But here again, if that's a message he got from The Fountainhead, and I don't know if that's the implication of the scene, it's again a strange interpretation and not actually what I think the author was going for. The theme of The Fountainhead, as the author herself described it, is individualism versus collectivism, not in politics, but in man's soul. And that, of course, raises the question, well, what is individualism in man's soul? Is it subjecting other people to your will because some people count like you and not others? Is it maintaining distance from people because you're afraid of them and you're afraid to suffer a loss? Or is it something else? That's what I want to talk about today. And part of the reason The Fountainhead is such a rich book is it's not simply portraying a conflict, a struggle between the individualists and the collectivists, the Roarks versus the Keatings and the Tuohys. It's also portraying a conflict among a number of central, crucial characters, all of whom, in one way or another, seem to be individualists. And part of the struggle is over, well, what individualism really is. And here I have in mind, of course, the three characters in the title of the talk, Roark, Dominique, and Wynand. And part of the reason I think that people have confusion about how to interpret the message of the Fountainhead is there is this struggle among people who seem to be individualists going on, and sometimes they'll take one of those views as the author's views, and it's not necessarily the one that she means to endorse. In fact, she maybe means to repudiate it. So I'm going to start by talking about the two views that I think Ayn Rand was critical of, was actually repudiating, and then we'll end with the one that I think she was supporting. So let's start by talking about Gail Wynand. You remember him as the very powerful newspaper publisher who is reviled by most of the characters of The Fountainhead at the beginning, but then some of them, Dominique and Roark, actually become friends with him. Dominique marries him. He grows up in impoverished conditions in Hell's Kitchen, New York, working various odd jobs. He works at one of his first jobs is at a newspaper, and he's selling papers on the street, and he tells his boss, wouldn't we get more subscription? Wouldn't we make more money, get more circulation if we delivered these papers to people? And his boss says, well, too bad you don't run things around here. And he does the same thing when he's working at a grocery store. His boss, he recommends we bottle the milk. His boss says, you don't run things around here. Same thing when he's working he says anything at when he's a bootblack for a ferry boat. You don't run things around here. And of course, because this is the message he's constantly given in his youth, Later on, when he becomes a successful newspaper publisher, he names his yacht the I Do. And it's not a homage to matrimony. It's an answer to the question to all the people who said you don't run things around here, because now he does. And in what way does he think he runs things, and how did he get to the point of this kind of success in the newspaper business? Well, in part, he succeeds through his native intelligence, but he also succeeds through hook and crook. He succeeds through violence and intimidation. When he finally starts running newspapers, part of his success is running a yellow press tabloid, where he kind of caters to the lowest common denominator of the public, giving them, exactly what the kind of sensationalistic coverage that they want. He thinks he's maintaining his own standards internally, but he's appealing to whatever base standards he thinks will make people happy, so that he can acquire this success. And along the way, he acquires a habit of wanting to break people of independence and integrity, because at some point he feels like he's himself given up, decided not to pursue a path of integrity. Something about people who still have it threatens him, and he wants to see that they can be made to compromise just like he had to as well. There's a scene toward the end of the book where he's having a conversation with Roark, who has somewhat, to our surprise, become his friend. And they're walking through the forest, and Roark pulls a branch off a tree and says, he says, "Now I can make what I want of it, a bow, a spear, a cane, a railing. That's the meaning of life." And Wynand says, "Your strength?" And Roark says, "Your work." And the fact that Wynand interprets this initially as the meaning of life is your strength is revealing and symbolic of his approach to the topic of independence and being an independent individual. He thinks it means exercising strength over other people. It means you're independent of subjection to their will because you're making them subject to your will. It's an idea that's reminiscent somewhat of the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, with whom Ayn Rand's own views are often confused. Nietzsche in The Antichrist says, "What is good? Everything that heightens the feeling of power in man, the will to power, power itself. What is bad? Everything that is born of weakness." So some people count, the ones who have power, the ones who have strength. Some people don't, the ones who are weak. That's Wynand's approach. But it is not the view of the author. It is not Ayn Rand's view of independence. It's a view she repudiates, and you can see the fact that she repudiates it from what happens in the story, from the fact that Wynand, in pursuing this path, it turns out that he's set himself up for failure. When he meets someone that he actually admires, someone whose integrity he cannot break, like Roark, it starts to change his mind. He starts to think, well, I could actually use all this power and money that I've acquired in order to defend him against the attacks from the public. But he finds that the public he's been catering to all these years doesn't want to listen at this point anymore. And so that power that he thought he had developed by catering to them is only an illusion. He realizes this to himself when he says, "You were a ruler of men, you held a leash. A leash is only a rope with a noose at both ends." So at least in the author's view, there's something wrong with this take on independence that Wynand has. This is not the kind of independence that's valuable, that's worth acquiring. Well, what kind is? Before I think we get a complete picture of that, we should look at the other major character, who I think is also not representative of the author's view, at least at a certain point in the novel, and that's Dominique. Dominique, of course, is the newspaper columnist, the daughter of Guy Francone, who's the architect, and the lover of Roark. And there's a scene quite near the beginning of the story where we meet her for the first time. We're starting to get to know her. She's having a conversation with her editor at the Banner, the paper owned by Gail Wynand, where she works. And Scarrett, her editor, offers her a new job, or offers her basically a promotion where she'd be doing even more writing even more columns on more issues. And she turns the job down. And she explains the reason that she's turning it down is because she doesn't want to have a job that she really loves, that she would be afraid of losing. And he's perplexed by this. He hasn't met anyone with this kind of attitude. And he asks her why. And she says, he asks her, what do you want out of life? And she says, I take the only desire one can really permit oneself. Freedom, Alva, freedom. And he says, you call that freedom? She says, to ask nothing, to expect nothing, to depend on nothing. Now, I really wanted to talk about that quotation today because it's one of the most misinterpreted quotations in the book. If you go to inspirational quote pages with lines from Ayn Rand, you'll find them listing this as something Ayn Rand said that was supposed to be inspirational and presumably something she would have agreed with.
And love is always around the corner.
But she didn't. Because this is a quote from Dominique at the beginning of the story when it should be clear that Dominique is a deeply flawed character who has a lot of development to undergo. And this quotation really capsulizes what the author takes to be her central mistake. What does it mean? How does she act on it? What impact does it have on her life? She's just like with her career, which she's afraid if she loves too much, someone might take it away from her, and then she would feel pain. She approaches all or most of her other values in the course of the book in exactly the same way. So, for instance, she meets Roark in the quarry. She immediately falls in love with him. And she's now terrified that she's fallen in love with someone and she might lose him. And she might lose him to the world, and especially because he's this fantastic architect, unconventional, who's being attacked by the world might destroy him. And then what kind of suffering would she have to undergo because of that? So she makes it her mission, even though she's carrying on a love affair with him, to destroy his career, fully with his knowledge, as you probably remember by going around trying to find clients for Peter Keating, his rival. And then when Roark actually starts to succeed, and he builds the Stoddard Temple, but there's a lawsuit that takes the temple away from him, adulterates the design. This seems to confirm the worst of her fears. And so she marries Peter Keating because now she wants to remove herself further from the sense of loss, from the possibility of loss. She then marries Wynand for much the same kind of reason. So she sees this as this kind of freedom to ask nothing, to expect nothing, to depend on nothing. She sees it as a way of freeing herself from the pain of loss. But what it ends up being is freedom from values, or what it would mean if she were to practice it consistently would mean freedom from the pursuit of values. Wynand himself actually sees this in Dominique at one point. He says that her theme is suffering because no happy person can be quite so impervious to pain as Dominique is. Her view is very similar to the philosophic view that's becoming, I think, popular these days among the popularizers of modern Stoicism, who think we need to steel ourselves against the dangers of loss by just not caring too much about things in the world. They take wisdom from someone like Epictetus, the ancient Roman philosopher, who says, eliminate desire completely, since if you desire something that is not up to us, you are bound to be unfortunate. But again, it's worth emphasizing that this kind of Stoic attitude and Dominique's attitude is something that the author repudiates. And you can see it from what happens to Dominique in the story. You can see it from the fact that Dominique herself comes to repudiate it. She does that when she gets to know Roark well enough and finds out that he's right, when she sees him succeeding in his pursuit of extremely ambitious, challenging values, in spite of the fact that everybody's attacking him. She realizes that she just cares too much about what the world thinks. She cares too much about the world's attempts to take things away. And she realizes at one point that she's committing the same mistake as Wynand. She says to Wynand, "We've committed the same treason somewhere." So we've talked about Wynand, we've talked about Dominique. What about Roark himself? What is it that Dominique learns from him such that she transforms herself and makes herself worthy of his love in the end? What is it that even Wynand realizes about Roark that makes him, at least for a while before he meets kind of with his tragic end, at least for a while starts to change? Roark's independence, Roark's view of independence is very different from both of theirs. What he is, ultimately what he is an independent thinker. He's an independent thinker who chooses his own beliefs, who chooses his own values, as opposed to simply going along with what he's supposed to think, with what's conventional to think. And he uses this independence primarily to ask himself the questions, what's actually true, not what do people think is true, what's actually good, not what do people just say and think is actually good. And he uses his answers to these questions not just to speculate philosophically, but to do the kind of building that Gina was talking about, to not just build buildings, but to build a life. You see, of course, when his architecture is described, that it's not classical, it's not Gothic, it's not Renaissance, it's only Howard Roark. He formulates his own independent principles of what makes architecture good. And when thinking about what makes a life good, you see him going through an independent process of formulating standards for himself as well. He observes early in the novel, there's something different between me and other people. He starts to call it the principle behind the dean. Why is it that some people are conventional and what he calls second-handed, whereas I don't think the way that they do? And what is it about the way they think that actually amounts to a kind of selflessness? What is the difference between that kind of selflessness and the independent kind of selfish attitude toward the truth and the good that I myself have? So Roark isn't and doesn't believe in the kind of quote-unquote independence that both Wynand and Dominique practice. So he doesn't have the Wynand approach. The Wynand approach is kind of the drill sergeant approach to independence. It's the idea that we're going to, in our relations with other people, subject them to our will. Instead, Roark is interested in creating values of his own that he will show for all comers to see. That if he creates the buildings that he wants, then the people who want that kind of building will come to him. And he's not the kind of freedom from loss independence that you see in Dominique, which is the Zen version of independence, as Gina would put it. Roark makes himself vulnerable by taking big risks, by being willing to suffer pain, because he knows that putting yourself out there and taking risks is the actual only way to achieve values. And he does suffer pain. I mean, he suffers great loss, various contracts. The Stoddard Temple, he loses Dominique for a while because of the situation she's going through. But he, of course, does achieve his values in the end. And one of the things that's really important here, and it came up in the last Q&A session, is that even though he makes himself vulnerable to that pain and suffers it, the pain, as he puts it, only goes down to a certain point. And I think part of the reason that it only goes down to a certain point for him is because in the course of actually pursuing real values out there in the world independently, he's building up values of character, values Ayn Rand elsewhere talks about as the cardinal values of reason, purpose, and self-esteem, that insulate him from the worst kind of pain because he's developed this fundamental self-confidence in himself. That, I think, is what his take on independence is. And I think it's what the author's take is. But don't take my word for it. Decide for yourself. Take a look again at the novel. Read it again with this view in mind. There's no better excuse to do it than the fact that it's the 80th anniversary of the Fountainhead. And then think for yourself about whether or not the author is right, that this is what independence is all about. And that I think you'll come to agree with me, but that is for you to decide. So thank you. Yes, back here.
So I read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged both like over a decade ago in college, and it felt like at the time that as I was becoming a more adultish intellectual, I guess, like I kept having them come up from adults that I respected. Like I needed to read these books. I'm curious if just what has transpired in the last 10 years. I don't know how closely you are tracking events with respect to historical cycles. If you think these types of ideas are going to have a diminished or expanded appreciation, given where we've been and where we're heading since then.
That's a big question. I don't know if I've been sufficiently tracking historical cycles to know for certain what the answer is. I mean, I think there's definitely ways in which our culture has become more hostile to independence, and other ways in which it's become better. There are, for the first, there's 1,000 examples of groupthink and conformity and really anti-truth ideological dogma that you see on campus everywhere. And not just coming from the political left, but in other ways, I think, from the political right. But there's also been some, in at least a few cases, healthy reactions to it. I think there's been more. There's a larger number of people who are now realizing there's something wrong with both sides of our political culture, who think we need to learn to have better discussions, we need to learn to have better debates, we need to not in a knee-jerking way side with one political tribe or the other. I find it encouraging that there's more discussion of just the phenomenon of what they call tribalism. Which of these two sides is more powerful today? I think it's probably the bad side, but I see hopeful rays of light everywhere, and like the fact that all these people came to this event is one of them. So it's the best I can do on that one. Yeah.
So I agree with your evaluations of the three characters. What I'm really interested in is how these characters interact with each other. And in the last part of the book, for instance, I was astonished how much love Roark shows towards Gale, especially when Gale, he has to concede finally that the paper needs to write against Roark, and then Roark, he tries so hard to get in touch with Gale to say, you can get past this, you can move on, but it doesn't work, obviously. So why does Roark have so much of love for Wynand?
It's a good question. I was just talking with Jason about this the other day. It is mysterious. given some of the bad things about Wynand. Like, he really takes a lot of sadistic pleasure in trying to break people. Even Roark at one point he tries to do this too. The best I can do to answer that question is to say it has something to do with Roark's love for ability, and he sees Wynand has so much of it, not just ability, but on a certain level, Wynand has reverence for values, which he is treasonous to in certain ways, but it's still there, and it's like the symbol of that is his art gallery. And that's something that Roark connects to and is then willing to make exceptions because of, which is a funny thing itself, because the love is exception-making thing is something he gets from Wynand and something I don't think that the author necessarily endorses. So it's mysterious to me. But it's also the case that I think one of the things I was talking with Jason about is that there's ways in which I think she's taking liberty with what's psychologically realistic. Like one of the things that she herself says, like it's psychologically unrealistic that Tui would be both as evil as he is and as self-conscious of his evil, but she's portraying him that way for kind of dramatic effect. And there's some kind of dramatic device going on here, I think, with the portrayal of this kind of relationship.
Ben, since you just stepped on my talk, can I just add something to your...
If you can do it in 30 seconds, because we got other hands.
In Roark's trial speech, he's talking about the creators, and he says, there's one in here today, who he won't admit it. So Roark sees Wynand as a creator. Yes, he created the banner to serve like these lowest trash values, but he made a newspaper, and then he made a media empire. And Roark sees that he could have also made something good, and it took competence and drive to do that.
And that's the ability issue. And I think part of it is that Roark thinks if he can only reach Wynand in the right way, then he can amplify that and encourage that.
That's not why he loves him for what he sees in him and for what he sees reflected back. I don't think that it's dependent.
We're going to have a panel.
We'll have a whole panel on it. Ask us again during the relationship
And you could ask one another.
Good point.
There's a hand in the back.
Well, on a similar note, considering Dominique is such a second-hander and has a malevolent universe premise, what does Howard respond to?
Well, I don't.
Like, what are the? Because she's gorgeous. I mean, what she's second-hander. She thinks everything's negative. Malevolent universe premise, and he looks at her and is like, yeah.
I don't think she's a second-hander, even though she has a malevolent universe premise.
Completely focused on me.
She is in a certain kind of implicit way that is also at odds with her conscious values, and that's her struggle. And I think it's the conscious part of it that he's in love with.
He sees that? I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for one thing, he sees what she sees in him, which is, nobody reacts to him like she does.
So
And I think that's my cue.